My name's Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the events we're looking forward to is Jonathan Evison in conversation with Thomas Costum about Evison's new novel, Legends of the North Cascades. That's 1 week from tonight, June 10th. And if you don't do so already, please follow us on social media where you'll get updates about all of our events and everything happening in our stores. Tonight, we are very thrilled to welcome back Benjamin Percy along with Victor LaValle. Benjamin Percy has won a Whiting Award, a Plimpton Prize, 2 Pushcart Prizes, an NEA Fellowship, and the iHeartRadio Award for Best Scripted Podcast. He's the author of the novels The Ninth Metal, The Unfamiliar Garden, The Dark Net, The Dead Lands, Red Moon, and The Wilding, as well as 3 short story collections and an essay collection. And he also writes Wolverine and X-Force for Marvel Comics. In his gut punch of a new novel, The Ninth Metal, the first in his Comet Cycle, Percy lays bare how a modern-day gold rush has turned the middle of nowhere into the center of everything, and how one family, the Frontiers, hope to control it all. The Ninth Metal is an explosive breakout speculative thriller in which a powerful new metal arrives on Earth in the wake of a meteor shower, turning life as we know it on its head. Percy's new novel has already received wide acclaim, including praises by the likes of Stephen King and Marlon James, the latter of whom said, quote, "Take 1 part dystopia, 1 part sci-fi, 2 parts apocalypse, then ride them roughshod through a bleaky and bloody Western, and it still wouldn't come close to what Ben Percy does here, which is blow open the core of humanity's dark heart," unquote. Ben joins us tonight from somewhere in Minnesota. Joining Percy in conversation this evening is Victor LaValle. Victor is the author of the short story collection Slapboxing with Jesus, as well as 4 novels and 2 novellas. And he's also the creator and writer of a comic book, Victor LaValle's Destroyer, which I have right there. He's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Bram Stoker Award, Shirley Jackson Award, and others. He joins us from New York. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question, as well as if someone has typed a question that you want to know the answer to, you can click the upvote button and like that question. Most importantly, please consider supporting Benjamin and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. A link to buy The Ninth Metal, along with a link to Victor's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times throughout this evening. Ben, Victor, we're so grateful to have you both here. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure.
So I should say that I grew up in Oregon. I live in Minnesota now, but I grew up in Oregon. And I bumped all over the state, but I spent most of my life just outside of Bend. And we didn't really have a bookstore back then. We had, a crappy Walden Books in the mall. And every few months we'd go over the Cascades and visit my grandparents in Portland. And Powell's is always a part of that pilgrimage. So it's, it's really an important space to me. It's always a highlight of every book tour. I'm sad that I can't be there now, but the benefits of Zoom, I couldn't be there now with Victor. And Victor is, not just a friend, but he's a writer I respect the hell out of, and I really am grateful to be not just talking to him tonight, but wading in the same weird waters together.
I feel exactly the same. And I'm really honored to be here and being able to get the chance to talk with you. But before we get to talk, if you're up for it, I would love if you'd read even a little something so that the folks who are here can get a sense of the book.
You got it. I'll keep it short because I know it's hard. Zoom fatigue is real. We're going to spend most of the night just bullshitting, I assure you. So this is the prologue. I've actually never read it aloud, so I'll probably mispronounce at least 2 words. Tune in. It begins with a comet. Decades ago, an infrared telescope captured the thermal emissions streaking through the solar system. Eventually, it was determined to be 300.2 kilometers wide and orbiting the sun in an elongated ellipse that would bring it within 500,000 miles of Earth. The moon, by comparison, is 238,900 miles away. This would be, scientists said, a beautiful light show that everyone should enjoy, all the more knowing that we'd narrowly escaped planetary annihilation. The official name of the comet was P/2011 C9, but most people called it Cain, the surname of the astronomer who discovered it. 20 years later, it burned into view and made its close pass by Earth. People took off work. They gathered at soccer fields and in parking lots, on rooftops and along sidewalks, setting up lawn chairs and picnic blankets and grills and coolers as though readying for a fireworks display. Everyone suddenly owned a telescope. Vendors sold Comet t-shirts and hats, and keychains and plush stuffed toys. Surfers stacked up on beaches waiting for the big waves they believed would come from the gravitational flux. At least 2 cults killed themselves off, announcing this was the end of the world and the comet a gateway to the vault of heaven. Professors and scientists and religious leaders became regular guests on cable news shows where they talked about how comets had long been associated with meteorological and human disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, and droughts. In 44 BC, when Caesar was assassinated, his soul was said to depart the earth and join the comet flaming overhead. In AD 79, a comet's arrival aligned with the eruption of Vesuvius. In AD 684, when Halley's comet passed by, the Black Death broke out, and in 1066, when it made another appearance, William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings. Celestial judgment and providence, or an instrument of the devil, as Pope Calixtus III called it. Heaven knows what awaits us, one professor said. It is a reminder of our irrelevant smallness and accidental existence in the universe, a glimpse of something violently outside the bounds of human existence, as close as you can come to seeing God. Local news reporters interviewed people on the streets. I don't know, it's just kind of cool, one man said. Special, once in a lifetime sort of deal. You want to be able to say, I was there. It's almost like we're living in this 2-dimensional life, and now there's a sense of it being 3-dimensional. You know what I mean? Cain looked like a roughly drawn eye, some said, or a glowing animal track, or a slash mark in the fabric of space, a wandering star. For a few days, the comet made night uncertain, hued with a swampy green light, and by day the sky appeared twinned with suns. And then gradually the comet trailed farther and farther away, and people forgot all about it. Until 1 year passed. The planet finished its orbit of the sun and spun into the debris field left behind by the comet. The residue of Cain's passage. This June, the sky would fall. That's what the newscaster said. The meteor shower was not as long-lasting as August Perseids, but for several nights the sky flared and streaked and wheeled, the constellations seeming to rearrange themselves with ever-shifting tracks of light, at first hundreds and then thousands and then hundreds of thousands, and finally an uncountable storm of meteors. The ground shook, windows shattered, grids of electricity went dark, satellites shredded, radio signals scrambled, dogs howled, and people screamed their prayers. Many of the meteors dissolved in the atmosphere, but many struck the earth, sizzling into the ocean, splintering roofs, searing through ice, punching craters into fields and forests and mountainsides like the seeds of the night. It was then that everything changed. Cue the thunderous applause.
I know I'm not the only one applauding, even if I'm the only one who can be seen applauding. That was great. That was great. And I wonder if we could just use that to just dive into actually, like, I mean, it's just such a great prologue. And that, I mean, I don't want to do, I guess we'll go wherever we go, but like to dive directly into the writing stuff, but like just that feeling of like, how do you Was that the first thing you wrote or the last thing you wrote? Maybe that's the way I want to talk about it because it
Yeah,
sets
yeah.
up things so well.
It's the first thing I wrote. It's also the first thing in every book
Yeah.
because all of these books are happening simultaneously. And that's a kind of a weird thing. I wanted to account for attrition with that because, every sequel sells fewer copies and these can be in order.
Right.
But I was also just thinking about this as the trigger event because what
Right.
I wanted to do is, and this is something we can definitely get into because you're doing the same thing. What I wanted to do is channel my work for Marvel and DC. I've been writing for comics since 2014, everything from Batman, Green Arrow, Nightwing, Teen Titans, Wolverine, X-Force. And I find pleasure, as so many others do, in the notion of a shared universe, right? The idea that what happens in Wonder Woman spills over into Batman, spills over into Superman, that there are implications, that these are all threading together and building towards something. And you see that same thing happening, of course, in literature,
Right.
right? I mean, look at Faulkner, look at Louise Erdrich. They're building shared universes.
Right.
So I wanted to sort of participate in that same tradition. And Stephen King, right? He's been building, especially in the Dark Tower series, but beyond that, that threaded together everything,
Right.
not just narrative tangents, but philosophically it bound them all together. And I wanted to have a trigger event that, and it's an age-old sci-fi concept. That's not the original part of this. The original part is what I do with what follows. But this comet comes streaking through the solar system. The Earth spins through the debris field. The new elements introduced, they upend the rules of biology and geology and physics and create chaos in the geopolitical theater, right? And it's a new dawn of heroes and villains. And so that opening, piece that I just read, right? That's me creating a new world within this world.
That's such a great way to put it, and to also give frame. So when I just want to make sure I understand. So for the audience, when you say it's the beginning of each of the books, you mean the trilogy?
Trilogy. But the thing is,
Yes.
like, it's been called a trilogy, but it's not a trilogy. In the idea of this is that it's infinitely generative. That I
Okay.
can just keep going, right? So the first book takes place in northern Minnesota and has to do with omnimetal. The second book takes place in the Pacific Northwest and has to do with alien plant life. The third book takes place in Alaska and has to do with mirror matter and dark matter. But in the periphery of all of these books, I've got Russia, I've got the Amazon, I've got a trench in the Pacific Ocean, I've got the Gobi Desert. I've got references to what's happening on a global scale, and I want to keep going. I want to keep moving outward and telling those stories as well. So yeah, we'll see.
So it really could be potentially just a sort of a world you step into and out of, depending on where your fancy takes you, like book to book.
Yeah. Right now, I mean, I've got other things mapped out. I've got a book mapped out right now that if they let me keep going, I'll keep going, and it has to do with kind of a black ops squad that's a series. They're collectors essentially.
Yeah.
They're going around collecting for governments and for whoever's willing to pay, debris from around the world that people are hoping to weaponize or collect.
Well, can we talk a little bit about like just even the choice of the comet and the meteor? Like maybe because of my age, I immediately thought of like Hale Bopp, right? And this, as your prologue lays out, the genuinely sort of almost divine, or if divine is the wrong term, because I don't mean necessarily good, right, or godly, but I do mean like otherworldly sort of importance or portent that humans put into comets, and then the meteor showers that fall. But like, what made you pick of all the things? Because other novels, you've done The Dark Net, you did werewolves. I mean, like you there's like an organizing principle. What made it the comet and meteors this time?
Well, I grew up in a weird sort of family in that I was talking about going to Powell's and we would stock up, right? We would build this this tower of mass market paperbacks.
Mhm.
And I say I grew up in a weird family because we're all just giant nerds.
Mhm.
And almost every night, as romantic as this sounds, we'd be sprawled out in the living room together reading. I mean, some nights we were watching Kung Fu: The Legend Continues and Star Trek: The Next Generation, but other
Ah,
nights we were reading. And my dad would be reading a science fiction novel, and my mom would be reading a Western.
mm.
And my sister would be, you know, she's the biggest nerd of all. She would be reading physics. Uh, and I'd be reading, you know, something with a dragon on the cover or a ghost on the cover with an embossed title. And anyways, you know, with my mom being so obsessed with westerns, and with my dad being so obsessed with sci-fi, that kind of like is part of my hard wiring.
Yeah.
And with this, you know, most sci-fi stories are westerns in disguise, you could say. Um,
Okay.
you know, and so I've sort of been trained for this moment in a way. So
Right.
my dad, like here we are on vacation as a kid, going through Eastern Oregon, and you know we've got rifles and fishing rods and camping gear, and also you know pickaxes and shovels in the back of the truck because we'd be rock hounding and fossil hunting and hunting and camping, and and stopping along the Lewis and Clark Trail, stopping along the Oregon Trail along the way. But then my dad would also have a telescope, and we'd spend a lot of nights staring up at the sky, and he'd be teaching us, you know, about the planets. And so I dedicated this book to him actually for that
Yeah.
reason. And so it's that, but it's also, and maybe you can relate to this. Over the past 4 years, I don't know, maybe it's age, maybe it's you know the political chaos we all endured, maybe it's the pandemic. You know, I felt a little bit numb.
Yeah.
I felt like a kind of a flatline feeling, like I
Mhm.
had lost my capacity for awe, not to
Yeah.
be dramatic about it. Um, and I wanted to, you know, I think part of the thing, one of the things I pinpointed to was that I feel like we know too much. Like there's this breaking news is assaulting me.
Right.
And I've actually made a step back from that. I try to read news only in printed form because I just had a time to marinate.
Right.
Um, so part of it, like something happens in Chicago, something happens in Beijing, something happens in Rio, wherever. I can get online and know everything about it immediately. I can
Yeah.
watch video, several, you know, different video feeds. I can hear firsthand testimony. I can hear a bunch of so-called experts hashing it out. And it's just it's a glut in my brain. And so
Yeah.
what I wanted to do was to lean into uncertainty instead, because
Okay.
in uncertainty, in the unknown, that's where you find wonder.
Mhm.
That's where you find awe. That's where you find the sublime. And so for me, creating this story was a challenge to myself as a writer, but also I hope it infectiously carries through to the pages themselves to the reader. You know, it was an attempt to sort of rediscover wonder in a way.
Yeah.
I know that sounds
Yeah.
a little cheesy, but it worked on me anyway.
Yeah.
And part of that wonder for me has always stemmed from looking up and taking in the vast bowl of the sky with all those stars sprinkled through it, and feeling just microscopically small, and my dad talking about infinite worlds and all that, you know. So that's like that's where it all stems from.
Wow. Well, I mean, you mentioning your mom and your dad and their reading habits, as you say, like it was almost like you were trained for this moment, but uh, as would be clear if someone's reading the book or whatever, the the sense that this novel is both those genres, like seems to be one and then becomes the other, and then sort of trades between them, right?
Right.
Between the sci-fi and the Western, right? Right down to the gold rush feeling and the sort of Age of Empire, not Age of Empire, but um, the robber baron families and all the rest, and so sort of looking back to that time to tell a story about the future of this country.
And I think that you can speak to this as well. I mean, I'll riff on that for a second, but I want to come back to you on that because, you know, one of the things that we're both doing is we're looking at the stories that came before us,
Mhm.
and we're engaging with them, and we're revising them in
Right.
different ways. And we're taking those mythologies and making them our own, or finding a new lens through which they can be explored.
Right.
And I think about westerns like, I taught this. I used to be a giant nerdy professor, and one of the classes, graduate courses I taught was called Rewriting the West. And
Mm.
in that course, we looked at the evolution of the Western. So we started off with, Owen Wister's seminal, The Virginian, and we
Mhm.
worked our way up to everything from Stephen Graham Jones to Leslie Silko, and just talking about these traditions and different styles, including
Mhm.
uh, cinema, and if
Yeah.
you look at John Ford, right, traditionalist when it comes to the way he's shooting Westerns, traditionalist when it comes to the archetypes,
Right.
and then then you move into like Sergio Leone, and if you look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, there's a really interesting opening scene in that maybe captures a bit of the essence of what you and I are doing.
Mhm.
And I want to talk about this in relation to like what you did with Frankenstein, for instance,
Mhm.
fairy tales. But the idea is that in the opening of the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know first you have this wide shot of a Western landscape. It looks very familiar. You're like, oh, this is like a tableau I might see in a John Ford Western.
Mhm.
And then this face comes swinging into view up close, uncomfortably close.
Uh-huh.
It's a jagged face that you feel like you're looking at some version of Red Rock. It's really
Okay.
right. So all of a sudden things are off.
Yeah.
You get a wide shot of this town. It's a single street town. It appears to be high noon. There's a
Mhm.
dude on one end of the street, two dudes on the other end of the street. You're like, oh, I know how this goes. They start marching toward each other. To add to the effect, there's a tumbleweed that blows by.
uh,
Rib slatted dog, a mangy dog that goes. There's a stagecoach with the canvas flapping. It's like all these elements that
right.
and you feel familiar. But then, as they toss their dusters aside and they spider their fingers toward their six shooters, instead of what you expect to happen, they join up. They go through the ribcage doors into the saloon and they start firing together.
Okay.
Then the window explodes and a guy jumps out, a new guy.
Uh-huh.
He's got a gun smoking in one hand and he's got a big hunk of meat in the other, like a big turkey leg.
Uh-huh.
Strips of meat hanging out of his teeth. And it pauses, which is also uncomfortable because that's not how a John Ford Western works.
Right.
And it goes, the ugly. And then you hear that.
Yeah.
And the camera goes into the saloon and you see those first guys, they're, dying on the floor. And it's just like what Sergio Leone is doing in that opening moment is like he's acknowledging legacy.
Right.
And then he's shattering all that stuff over his knee. And
Right.
he's saying something new about the West, right? He's saying something about not a white hat or a black hat cowboy. He's saying, everybody's wearing brown hats.
Right.
And there's he's saying something different about the cowboy. The cowboy's not like a white knight. The cowboy is an ignoble, rapacious presence in the West.
Right.
And that's the way my brain works. And I think it's, if you could speak to that, I think it's the way your brain works too.
Well, it's interesting you said like I do think when I was a younger writer, I think I suffered under the delusion that I had to, if I was going to write anything, create anything, it had to be divorced from what came before, right? And it was sort of like, the point was to be so original that people would say like, I never saw something like that before,
Yeah.
right? And what I came to realize with time was exactly what you're saying is that number one, of course, nothing kind of appears out of nowhere. Everything is falling into some sort of tradition or traditions, right? But the biggest loss of thinking the way I used to think was you don't get to have any of the emotional energy and intellectual energy that people are already naturally bringing to your work because of the signs and signals that you're playing with. I just watched this Mayor of Easttown, the Kate Winslet show. And one of the things I found interesting was like I was watching it and I was kind of like first episode I was kind of like, so it's just a police procedural. Like that's it. Okay, you know, she's such a good actor and she's surrounded by so many good actors. I'll enjoy this, but it's not really doing anything new,
That's
right?
what I was thinking at first as well. Crime
Yeah.
comfort is what I was feeling.
Yes. But then maybe you felt the same. But what I came to understand by say like maybe by the third or fourth episode was the idea that like, oh, I was drawn in the way I was supposed to be, which is like, here's a dead body, here's a cop, here's a town. But then, of course, I mean, I don't want to ruin in case anybody's on here hasn't started watching yet, um, but the show quickly pivots to be about people living in the aftermath of great trauma and realizing like, oh, they got me because I came in enough, even if I was rolling my eyes sometimes, like, yeah, of course this is going to be in it. And of course this is going to be in it. Of course. But by the third or fourth one, I went like, well, that was just the train track, but it wasn't the train.
Yeah.
And what's in that train is just a small Pennsylvania town and the ways that everybody's sort of carrying something with them and kind of going, oh yeah, that's maybe on some level the equivalent of what you're saying about Sergio Leone, to like flip it on you and say, oh no, all you're going to do is just watch a bunch of middle-aged people just working through their stuff. And then the amazing thing is being like, I'm kind of enjoying that part. I'm enjoying that part even more than the cop stuff, quite frankly, you know. But I wouldn't have gotten to that without it.
The final moment in Mare really speaks to what you're saying. It's not a spoiler,
Yeah.
what I'm talking about. You know, the final image is like, and Kate Winslet is holding someone who's weeping. And you know, it captures that notion of trauma in that image.
Yeah.
It feels almost biblical. It feels like a Caravaggio painting.
Yeah.
And that sums up the point of the series, really. And you're doing this too in, you know, earlier Kevin held up Destroyer. You know, you're acknowledging a canonical text.
Yes.
Frankenstein. It's a familiar text, right? Just like you're talking about the familiarities of the police procedural.
Right.
You bring everybody in with that. You know, you give them a tickle, and you say,
Right.
"Come in."
Right. Right.
And then you just smack them across the face with the story you're actually telling.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it was very similar, and like even to the point, like the artist and I, Dietrich Smith, we'd the idea that the first image you would see was the creature on an iceberg as a way to say like, we know why you're here. Here he is, and then even for him to sort of in the first couple of pages, the big journey for the reader, I think, was you're used to Frankenstein, you're used to loving Frankenstein, but I'm going to take you back to the original Frankenstein, who by the end of that book, I mean, Frankenstein's monster, who by the end of that book is a mass murderer who kills children, he kills women. He's so full of rage that no one is safe, and say like, let's go back to that. And it was interesting to see like people's like readers' reactions to that shift. And you know, certainly there were people who enjoyed it, and then there were other people who were like, it took me a little while to like, when he killed these people, I said that's fine, but when he then killed these people, I felt, you know, like a bit of a shiver or a shock, you know. Yeah. And that was the gift of it all, right? In the same way you're talking about like revitalizing or rethinking the Western and the West, and like what that genre actually means. And then in this case of your book, like then also bringing in the idea of like, I mean, even just the other idea of like this part of the United States that on some levels perhaps is often left to its own devices, let's say, suddenly becoming the center, at least for now, of commerce and power and wealth, and that feeling like a thrilling sort of surprise as well, you know.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about northern Minnesota for a number of reasons. One is that it's a liminal space. It's in northern Minnesota. What is U.S., what is Canada, what is tribal, what is private. It's a constant debate up there. And if I'm writing a story that's about different worlds, and when I say that, I'm talking about the multiverse, different worlds converging, it seemed like a good backdrop for that. But also, like, it's a space of decline. Like, it used to be the center of the world for steel.
Right.
The Iron Range is where all that taconite came out from, shipped all over the world. And then, like so many other places in the Midwest, it experienced decline. And there's a constant debate up there as to whether, what's more important? Is it more important to protect these wilderness areas, or is it more important to, encourage people's livelihoods with further, by further mining and copper nickel in particular? So, it was sort of a ripe space for me to set this in and create this contemporary Deadwood situation.
Right.
And yeah, and we were talking about comics before, talking about Destroyer, and we both, Victor can't say what he's working on right now, but we're both at Marvel playing around with some different stuff. And it's interesting too how some of what we're talking about here carries over to that, right? Because when we're writing Marvel characters, these are characters we grew up with.
Yeah.
The characters that everybody knows. It's become our common mythology in a way. Like, if it used to be everybody like watched the same show.
Right.
You could go to school, you could go to the office, whatever. Everybody watched whatever Survivor season 1 last night.
Right.
Or The Sopranos last night. But we're so splintered now with all these different platforms. Nobody watches the same thing except Marvel movies.
That's absolutely right. That has become the big living room.
And so, there's a lot of pressure that comes with that and a lot of joy, but you have to, I'm curious about your approach when it comes to these legacies and putting your unique stamp on it all. Because, my common strategy is not only do I grow up with these characters, and I've read the hell out of them, but I go, whenever I have the opportunity to write somebody, I always do a deep dive. Yeah. And I had this great learning experience with Jeff Johns, who was at the time the chief creative entertainment officer at DC. He's also a fantastic comics writer. And, I was at the DC mothership, and one wall of the boardroom where he met was windows looking out on Burbank, and another wall was this big whiteboard, floor to ceiling. And we spent the whole day there, and we were breaking story, and we were breaking Green Arrow. And so what we did is we listed all of the great Green Arrow stories. We listed off the best villains and love interests and the core tenets of the character, and we broke everything down, and then we tried to build it back up.
Yeah.
And find a new way of telling, right? And figure out some of the elements that have been lost in previous runs. And so that's what I always do now. I'm trying, because there's an elasticity, I think. People aren't just looking for karaoke. They don't just want you to be the cover band.
Yes.
This goes for our novels as well, and what we're trying to do. In the Changeling, you're not just rewriting channeling fairy tales. You're absolutely making them your own through a contemporary lens. Same way with these comic books. Nobody wants the cover band of Batman, no matter what they say on Twitter. What they want is like the signature run. So Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo have a signature run of Batman, and that it is actually a story about Gotham.
Right.
Right. And with, when I take on Wolverine, I'm trying to do the same sort of thing. Like, here's this opportunity for Wolverine to finally feel like he's part of a nation, finally has a family, finally feels some sense of, is it possible, happiness.
Right.
And testing that. And I'm curious how you play around similarly with these characters that I know are beloved and part of your DNA.
Well, let me say, just for the audience sake, so in about 5 minutes, we're going to move over to the Q&A. Like, I'm loving this conversation, but I already see some questions popping in the Q&A. And so I want to read those off, and I want to just tell anyone who's got questions to please feel free to pop them into the Q&A, because I'll start reading those soon. And then the other,
for
and we'll
Victor-
dive into those.
Victor and I both ask us both.
Yes, yes. And then the other thing I think it's worth sharing is we're both writing for Marvel right now. This is my first time writing for one of the big two. Ben's been, obviously, as he said, like been doing it for a while now, and across so many great stories. But we're both in the X office. I guess that's the one thing I can say, right? And I guess as a sort of like a window into that X office, I think we can share, like, we have weekly meetings or bi-weekly meetings with everyone who is a part of the X office. That includes maybe, I think it's 4 or 5 editors, and then what is it, about 15 writers altogether, who, if you're reading the books, you'll know all the various people. And for me, it was my first time. I haven't been in any kind of writer's room yet, but so it's my first writer's room experience. And it's been like a remarkable, in a way that is maybe cousin to what you went through with Jeff Johns. I mean, that sounds like just amazing, for like being thrown into like how to really think through the process of it all, on my end, the one gift I have is that the one thing I can say is that I'm writing a villain. I'm writing a story about one of the villains, and in a way, I feel a lot more leeway, in part because, number one, as our 10-year-old son would say, villains have a lot more latitude, right? Which is part of why I love in your X-Force run, why, like, I think so many people personally love Beast now, or love to hate Beast now, because you have made him, you've made him James Jesus Angleton. You've made him the founder of the CIA. And it's so complicated. And I love seeing, like, looking on Twitter and stuff like that, and seeing people who are like, how could Beast do that? How could he manipulate people like that? And then other people being like, hey, that's how you got to run a nation. That's how you got to make things work. And how it's all about like getting your hands dirty. But for a character like Beast, who I feel like, overall, as much as people love him, has often been more of I want to say like a sweet uncle kind of character. It's been, like, to my mind, one of the most exciting sort of rethinking, relaunches of a character. Because I feel like he can't go back now. You know what I mean? Like, whenever you decide you want to stop writing X-Force, anyone who's dealing with Beast after this, it's just a whole new, you know what I mean? Like, it's obviously the Wolverine stuff, but in a way, like, Wolverine, he's always going to get that shine. So all the great work you're doing there always gets that shine. But the Beast stuff is also so like, wow, you went to there and
I know
there.
I know exactly when my X-Force runs ends, what happens to Beast. So
You even know that. Okay, right. You're planning, because you're planning everything. You're planning everything. But like, I will say on my end, like, the pleasure of it all, being in the room, number one, is also like the depth of knowledge that people have is so amazing. And then also within reason, the leeway I've been, like, I can't suddenly change, let's say, the power set of my villain, right? But short of that,
there's a lot of creative.
Yeah, it really is just sort of like, well, can you make it a good story? Does it sound interesting? All right, then let's go with that. And that's been like amazing.
Surprisingly, a lot of freedom, given that we're part of a corporate, giant corporate entity.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been actually amazed by, I think, in a way, like, especially once as you mentioned, like, once Marvel became the sort of one of the few things that, quote unquote, everybody's talking about. I was amazed that getting into that X room was not like, well, look, we've already decided that in 5 years this will be happening to so and so on the screen, and we've already cast them, so you better do that. Like, it's nothing like that, and it's really amazing.
And I feel like I have learned a lot as a novelist from writing comics.
Yeah.
In part because their structure is so tight.
Right.
You have 20 pages and you have 5 to 7 scenes, and there is an A plot, a B plot, a C plot, and D plot, and that B plot typically becomes the A plot of the next issue. And
Right.
there's a splash in the first 5 pages. A splash is a single image that takes up a whole page, and there's a splash typically at your cliffhanger closer. And I could go on, but the idea that Terrence Hayes puts forward when he's talking about the difference between free verse poetry and form poetry, like a sonnet or a villanelle, he says it's cool if you can break dance, but it's badass if you can break dance in a straitjacket. And I feel like writing comics is breakdancing in a straitjacket.
Right.
And sometimes those constrictions are actually inspiring.
Yeah.
And two, there's so much to be said about the way in which comics sort of turn up the volume on it. I'm trying to borrow from this in the Ninth Metal and in the Comet Cycle as a whole. The way that comics turn up the volume on things, especially with the villains, where the villain is almost always born out of the core wound of the character. Internal trouble that they're wrestling with finds, it's externalized.
Right.
Batman would not exist without Crime Alley,
Right.
without Martha and Bruce Wayne getting shot in Crime Alley and the pearls and the blood,
Right.
splashing everywhere. And Spider-Man would not be Spider-Man without Uncle Ben being killed by the burglar, and so on. But the villains themselves, they're typically a dark mirror or an opposite of the character. And they are replicating these internal wounds. Like Batman's Rogues Gallery is the best there is, right? And you've got if it's a Two-Face story, then it's asking the question: is Bruce Wayne the man and Batman the mask, or is Batman the real man and Bruce Wayne the mask? If it's a Scarecrow story, it's about taking those fears that Bruce felt as a kid and weaponizing them.
Right.
If it's a Dr. Freeze story, it's about Bruce's internal coldness.
Right.
And the Joker's about chaos, and on and on and on we go, right? In the same way, I'm trying to create, all of my characters are, I have a few characters who might be stand out as villains in this book. But in a way, they're all traumatized, and they're all wrestling with that by fighting each other in different capacities.
Right.
So that, a sister character for John Frontier is one of the main characters. Like, she kind of represents what he used to be, and she keeps dragging him back down to his childhood where he was breaking the rules, and so on and so forth. And I just think it's interesting how comics just distill everything in a clear manner. You're able to see these formulas and then make them and sort of, complicate them and make them into advanced trigonometry when you're playing around the larger canvas of the novel.
The funny thing is, this may feel like it answers the first of the questions in the Q&A, but I feel like there's room for it to even go on. It says, how have comic books influenced how you write prose fiction? Are there any tips and tricks you've taken from writing comics to writing novels? I mean, you already mentioned a bunch of them, right? I do feel like the other thing that is, speaking for myself, like as I'm getting into it, along those same lines, like, I think what comics get to do that novels have to think about how to translate, right, is you can distill things down, but the way that things are saved from feeling flat is the art, right, is the visual storytelling. And I do sometimes have to remind, like I'm thinking about when I'm teaching writing or when I'm thinking about my own stuff, like to remind myself, like, you don't have an artist, like you're the artist and you're the writer and you're the inker and the colorist. Like, you have to think about all of those aspects and figure out how to use prose to do all those things, right? If you're going to try to, on some level, mirror that sense of how dynamic a page can be, So I wanted, are there any other things, like and in particular, this is from David, he's asking, tips and tricks you've taken from writing comics?
Yes, I mean, I covered a few of them, but also just the way in which I wanted to roll out these books, I took a cue from comics. So comics come out, right, as $2.99 floppies.
Right.
Those floppies are come together with 5 issues as a trade paperback, and that trade
Mhm.
paperback maybe becomes a deluxe hardcover, and maybe that later becomes an omnibus, and that just makes sense to me.
Mhm.
You know, it is, you create cheap wide distribution, you build word of mouth,
Right.
and then you offer up more expensive collector's items. I mean, I go see a movie for $7, and later on I buy the $35 Blu-ray with director's cut.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense to me. And maybe Powell's is going to be mad at me for saying it. It doesn't make sense to me why you would put out up front a $36 hardcover. If I, as somebody who is inside the industry, who's a nerdy reader, who's always picking up books, if I am sometimes hesitating to buy hardcovers, how does everybody else feel?
Yeah.
And so what the thing I wanted to do with this book series is I not only pitch the content of these stories, I also pitch the rollout, in
Mhm.
that it's paperbacks that come out in quick succession every 6 months. There's a new
Right.
novel. And then later on, we build a hardcover omnibus with short stories that are new and
Oh,
illustration,
wow.
essay, and all that kind of stuff.
So that's the plan. That's been the plan all along.
Yeah, that's the master plan. It could
Wow.
totally bomb, but
But I mean, but I remember like my first book long ago in '99, Book of Stories came out. It was like a paperback original, and I remember even then they were saying like one of the reasons that they obviously there's the profit. It's a much higher profit for a $30-something hardcover, but the other thing was that if they're talking about prizes, if they're talking about things like that, there was this bias against the idea that a paperback original was as good, quote unquote, as a hardcover. I mean, I feel like by now that same bias is not there, I hope, or is much reduced, you know. But I do remember that as a kind of holdover. And even at the time, I sort of thought, like, yeah, but you
that's
want
that
people to
same
take a risk.
snobbish exclusion, right?
Yes.
Going to keep people from reading. People spend $7 on a caramel mocha with sprinkles.
That's
They'll
right.
buy a $8
They'll
paperback.
buy an $8 paperback. That's right. All right, let me read this next one. This is very kind. I love Destroyer and Changeling and Darknet and Wolverine X-Force and how you both wrestle with real life issues in fantastical ways. I think there's something about transplanting serious issues into a fantastic setting or even just fictionalizing it that allows people to see a problem anew, but I don't know what it is. Do you think the distance of reality works that way? Especially since we just lived through such a bizarre world for the last 18 months, much less the previous 4 years? And if so, do you think that has a lasting effect? Can it change minds?
That's a good question. And I think
Mm.
Michael McBride, I think that's a Minnesotan right there. Thanks for hanging out in Oregon with us. So for me anyway, and I'm curious to hear Victor's response to this, but you know, I've always loved the crack mirror that we hold up to reality. You know, I like to be political without being polemical. I like to channel cultural unease, but do it in a way that is indirect. And I think that if you look at some of the great speculative stories, whether it's Frankenstein, which is kind of about the Industrial Revolution and man playing God and rise of science and technology, and if you look at Godzilla, it's about post-atomic anxieties. If you look at the Red Scare, it directly informs Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and we could keep going on, right? We could even track the Living Dead movies and how each of them came from a different era and kind of
Yep.
represents a different, cultural moment. Um, and and so for me, it's always been, and Margaret Atwood does this, it's been a great way to sort of address some of the things that the headlines might be wrestling with or that I might be wrestling with
Mhm.
in a way that isn't uh, lecturing or exclusionary. Instead, it invites people in and you ask questions. Star Trek was doing this all the
For
time.
sure. For sure. I mean, I also think, I mean, along those lines, um, obviously literary realism about real world subjects has a wonderful audience, right? Like, but I do think that there's something powerful about the way that uh, using genre to talk about those issues, kind of, for lack of a better term, like it allows you to talk actually more directly about the issue than being direct could. And I mean, you use the Living Dead series. I mean, neither neither Living Dead as a way to talk about whatever we want to say, tribalism, about the if we, even though Romero said it was purely an accident, the main lead was black, it has a powerful effect in the way that the story is told, and in particular in how that ending hits the viewer, versus if it was just that guy just drove up to a house and then there was like these disparate white people inside and they said, hey, we can't get along. You know what I mean? Like nobody's watching that movie 40 years later, 50 years later, whatever it is. So I do find there's something beautiful about the way that talking about those things through genre makes people sort of drop their defenses a bit.
Yeah.
Like again, like the Mayor of Easttown. Oh, it's just a cop show. And then by the end, oh no, it's about how people need to wrestle with these things and stop trying to just tuck them away and pretend that they don't affect us. Okay, you know, but if you said in the first episode that's what it's about, I don't know that it would have had the same reach that it did now, you know.
They just called it trauma with an extra.
Trauma with Kate Winslet. All right, let me jump into this next one. Let's see. Do you feel your stories are grounded in place despite their science fiction elements? Do you feel that adds to their relatability?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm always. That's why it's taken me this long to set a story in Minnesota. I've lived here for close to 10 years now. All of my stories otherwise are set in the Pacific Northwest where I grew up. You know, and it's about learning not just the geography of a place, it's about the culture, the politics, the vernacular, the myths of a place, and being able to replicate them on the page. You never, there's nothing worse, right, than a story that takes place in your back 40 that people got wrong or that has that tourist perspective. And so I'm trying to authenticate that with as many granular details as possible because, as they say, right, a story that seems to happen no place seems not to happen at all.
I like that. Yeah, you know, in my case, like also I'm a kid from New York. I write very much about New York, and then but like the thing I'm working on now takes place in Montana in 1915, and so I know that is not my place of expertise. So like I wrote a story about Iceland. I've written about a couple other places, and the way I usually try to get around it is that I have my main character be someone who's coming there brand new. They're not a local, and I've found that has made me feel more confident about, like, at least, because then, I mean, obviously the mistakes are mine if they're there, but there's room for like, oh, well, they wouldn't know because they're new. Yeah. And I kind of go, yeah, that's right. That's why it's not in there. It's just that they're new. It's not that I didn't know or that I messed up, you know.
I use that trick all the time when I'm writing something speculative.
Yes.
The rookie perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's always, you know, whether you look at like Training Day,
yep,
you know, the Ethan Hawke character or whatever, Harry Potter,
yes,
or even Sonny's Blues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have the perspective character who doesn't really know about the world they're entering into. You know, whether that world is the world of magic or the world of, you know, jazz pianists.
Right.
And so you're able to sort of carry that exposition with you and feed it to your reader in a really organic way.
Yep. I mean, it's an age-old, there's a reason it's stuck around. Yeah. All right. I like the two themes of worlds and responding to legacies. How do those two elements relate to identity and agency in your work?
That's a smart question. I feel like I need to write a thesis on this one.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to come back around to, I'm going to think about that for a little bit. I'm going to read the next one. I think it's more direct, and we can come back around as we're wrapping up. Ben, you mentioned earlier that you're currently mapping out a future book in the cycle. what's your process look like for doing that, or
Yeah,
multiple books?
over over yonder, I have a closet in my office, and that closet, the previous owner of this home used as a dark room. They were a hobby photographer, so appropriately, in the dark room, I hang up all of my ideas. You know, it's my nightmare factory, and I've got articles tacked to the wall, usually in clusters connected to different things, different topics I'm researching. I have scenes that have no home yet. I just have a scene in mind. I have characters. I have all of these different things, including roadmaps. And so what I typically do is I rip off a big chunk of paper for my kids. What they used to have these Melissa and Doug art easels. They're typically, but I've still got the paper, and I rip off, you know, the scroll of paper and I tack it up. And on the left-hand side, I've got these characters, and that's who I build first. You know, I have Wikipedia entries on each of them, and I draw them, even I cartoon them. And then once I figure out who they are, I figure out what they want. And once I figure out what they want, I'm able to, like a cruel god, put obstacles in the way of their desire. And that's when I start to work my way across the scroll with like the first stirrings of plot.
Right.
So I sometimes do this for a screenplay, for a novel. I sometimes sit with this or hang with this, it's up on the wall, for a year, 2 years before I ever even hit the keyboard. And so that's generally how my mind works on those bigger projects, because I know from experience, Victor, I don't know, maybe you wrote your first novel and it was just off to the races, but you know, my first novel was The Wilding that I published, but I had 4 failed novels in the drawer before that.
Right.
So that kind of that scares you as a writer. It makes you never want something to turn to dust in your hands again. So I always am committed to an outline. It's an outline in pencil. I'll change everything, but an outline is like my security blanket.
It's funny you said, like, I have to say, like, my first novel was the second novel I tried. It was the first one I finished, but it was only after I published the novel after that that I realized the first novel wasn't a novel. It was a series of interconnected stories. And I just didn't understand the difference between a story and a novel. And the idea, like, so I had just thought, like, I'll just do 20-page stories about the same people, and that's a novel. And with time, I realized, like, no, that's 20 stories. But, you know, but I called it a novel. So in a similar way, I do think, like at this stage now, there's that sense of thinking about, like, is this story a story that even needs the depth and breadth of a novel? Maybe it is just a story. And if it is a novel, though, maybe I need to start mapping this out and thinking about it. But I want to dive into one more question. It's from the same person who asked the previous question. So I feel like if we answer this one or talk about this one, I think we'll still be all right. Villainy, core wound, both Disney pre-acquisition and MCU moves for creation of protagonist. Trauma, and more trauma. Is there an oversaturation with this formula?
I mean, the thing I always say is, if you look at stories, there is a familiarity across platforms, even. You know, if you look to comics, if you look to country songs, if you look to novels and movies, you know, if you break them down to the beats, to the skeleton, take off their clothes, they're all kind of the same in a way. But that sameness, which I've noticed this in literary circles especially, people want to fight back against any sort of prescription or formula.
Right.
That same skeleton, you could think of it in humanistic terms, right? The same skeleton that we carry around with us, you know, and the same general arrangement of organs, right? That's Donald Trump, but that's also Cher, right? that's Sylvester Stallone, but it's also Steve Buscemi. Like, we're all built in pretty much the same way, and yet there's all these variations. And in the same way, that same model gave you a Princess Bride, but it also gave you Rocky IV.
Right.
So there are an infinite number of directions you can go with these beats that feed us. that are comforting to us, that draw us in, like we were talking about, to circle back to the beginning of our conversation,
Yeah.
that draw us in, and then you surprise your reader with something new.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think like I would just say, yeah, the trauma isn't the issue. I would almost say it's like maybe there's a repetition of like tone or repetition of and maybe weariness for the person asking the question about you know how it's been handled, but certainly the idea of trauma as an aspect of human development and nature seems still vital, right? All right, so we got one last question that is super easy to answer, and then I know we're at time. What software do you each draft on?
I mean, I'm pretty boring. I use Microsoft Word and Final Draft. Although,
Yeah.
of course, I got a new Mac, and there's some sort of issue with the family, you know, having now a Microsoft account, and I can't get
Right.
into it. I've been using Pages, and I hate
Oh no!
hate
Oh
it.
no!
I hate it.
Yeah, I'm the same. It's Microsoft Word, Final Draft. I know there's one other screenwriting. I wish I could. Shoot, I wish I could remember the guy. John August.
Any software besides Final Draft?
Yeah, there's a John August who has a great
right.
podcast called the
Script Notes.
Script Notes podcast. He has developed a screenwriting program that is like infinitely cheaper than Final Draft, apparently. And it's kind of like my friends who are trying to always get me into Scrivener. I know I should. I'm just being a little slow. But apparently this, if the person asking is interested in other screenwriting softwares, if you go on John August's website, he's got it.
And hey, if you like, you know, totally nerdy discussions of craft, that podcast, Script Notes, is a great one.
Yes,
for
just
sure. Dissecting movies and stories.
That's right. Well, I think on that note,
yeah, we have
had our this has been such a blast, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Down the trail, let's hoist a few and talk nerdy in person, please.
Absolutely.
It's just around the corner, I think. All right. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Victor. I'm going to put this link to our YouTube channel in the chat, and you can click on that. This event will be on our YouTube channel probably sometime tomorrow. You could also look at some of the other events that we've had there. It's a lot of fun to go through those. And then also I'm going to put the link for Ben's paperback of the Ninth Metal in there as well, so you can click on that. This is what it looks like. It's beautiful. Victor's Destroyer. He also edited this awesome anthology, People's Future of the United States. Thanks, you guys, for having this great discussion, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And join us on pals.com, see what else is coming up, and we'll see you guys later.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thanks, Victor.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good night.